Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Walter Stern. He's Assistant Professor of Educational Policy Studies and History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He got his PhD in history from Tulane University. His research focuses on the historical intersection of race and education in the urban United States. Today, we talked about his latest book, Race and Education in New Orleans, Creating a Segregated City, 1764 to 1960. He's from Louisiana. He taught in a public high school in Mississippi and wrote about education for a daily newspaper in Georgia. We talked about the deep history of colonial New Orleans, resistance to slavery and education, self-defense, and the long legacy of white terrorism involved with education in New Orleans. Thanks to awareness for the music as always.
My first question, I wanted to start out where you started in the book, and you kind of you put the margins of your book, along with a lot of other topics, with Marie Justine Cerner and Ruby Bridges. Mm-hmm. And Marie Cerner was kidnapped and put into enslavement as a 7-year-old girl, and then she was brought over eventually to New Orleans or the Crescent City. And I was wondering if you could kind of give listeners a background of who she was and her significance.
Yeah, so I mean, as you were saying, she was kidnapped and enslaved as a very young girl, spent time in slavery in what was at the time the French colony of Saint-Domingue. She was born in the late 1750s, arrived in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, but was then a French colony in the 1760s, and arrived in New Orleans in 1804, and by the time she was in New Orleans, she had gained her freedom, possibly through the Haitian Revolution, which had taken place by that point, or possibly through other means. The reason I start with her in the book is that she had a tremendous and really under-recognized impact on education in New Orleans. Once she was in New Orleans, she was able to acquire property, most likely using money that she earned as a marchand, somebody who was selling various goods at marketplaces around town. And in her will, she left one piece of property that she had in the Faubourg-Marigny section of New Orleans, which is the neighborhood just downriver from the French Quarter. She left that property for the establishment of a school for free children of color, specifically for free orphans of color, and the people in her social network, largely free men of color, also property owners in that neighborhood, built up a school that really became a counterweight to the whites-only public school system that was established in the 1840s. And while the public school system that was established in the 1840s really reflected the origins or development of public school throughout the United States, in that it was racially exclusionary, this school that was created through Marie Cernier, who came to be known as Marie Couvent, the school that was created through her quest, presented an alternate vision of the relationship between schooling and citizenship and schooling and democracy. And the educators at that school, as well as many of the students, went on to play a very significant role in politics in the city and in pushing forward really revolutionary changes during the Reconstruction era. But throughout its history, the teachers and students at the school, which came to be known as the Catholic institution, they treated it as a public school, and they sort of, through the school, asserted that at a time when they were denied rights, at a time when the U.S. Supreme Court said black people had no rights that the country was bound to respect, folks used this school to assert that they were part of the public, that they were citizens, and it was a sort of both a statement, but then also the school really became a sort of proving ground or training ground for future leaders within New Orleans' black community.
Thank you for that clarification and foundation on her. And I went to look her up on the internet, and there's not much information really written about her that's out in the open and easy to find. So thank you for writing about that. There's something else I think that ties in with Marie is you write about how the, quote, fluid reality of New Orleans clashed with Enlightenment thinking on white supremacy. And at this time, this is when you had Western philosophy that was promoting white supremacy and slavery, such as John Locke, who wrote some of South Carolina's slave constitution and had stocks in the Royal African Trading Company. And can you kind of talk about how New Orleans was always kind of a stalwart of kind of fighting this and being more of an inclusive society at the time?
Yeah, and so I think it's important to recognize that while racial status and racial order in colonial New Orleans, under French and the Spanish, while it was more fluid, say in contrast to British colonial America, where earlier and in sort of clearer ways there was a strict binary racial order between black and white. While there was greater fluidity and flux in New Orleans, it still was and became a slave society, and a society in which race was a marker of status and where there were significant power imbalances. But New Orleans, unlike some other places, developed a very sizable free black population alongside a very sizable enslaved black population, and that was through both people of African descent who had served in the military and gained their freedom through military, through somewhat more relaxed manumission policies of the French and especially the Spanish. And it kind of in theory, European colonizers in New Orleans saw a free black, often racially mixed sort of middle caste as a group that could sort of align with white European Americans to keep the very large slave population in New Orleans and in Louisiana in check. But often free people of color use their kind of intermediary status to sort of carve out greater freedom and autonomy. And it's a very kind of complex relations because there are examples where free people of color, certainly many examples of free people of color who own slaves, examples where they seem to be at times aligned with Europeans or European colonizers who are white, but often their position and relationship to whites as well as to enslaved was very complex, and they were sort of carving out freedom for themselves, and also in many cases when free black people in New Orleans owned slaves, sometimes it was strictly for their financial gain, but often it was a means of keeping their family and families together. And so on paper, someone was owned as a slave, but existed within the family or within a very different relationship with the free black person who owned them.
Yeah, and thanks for clarifying that. And I wanted to move this topic into something that I think you write really well with is not only speaking about the tragedy and the violence of colonialism and white supremacy, but you also tie into your narrative survival and black resistance and self-defense and how that tied in with education. One thing I found interesting was when you spoke of the city's free black militia that was using the language of the Louisiana Purchase to, as you say, to assert an equal standing with the, quote, American Republic. And then you also mentioned how at this time education was greatly affected by David Walker's writings about armed resistance and Nat Turner's rebellion. And I was wondering if you could give a little foundation or summary into how these acts of resistance and self-defense were tying in with the attack on education with the black population.
One of the main themes that became clear to me through the researching of the book and the writing of the book was that white supremacy and the subordination of people of African descent was a project that took a lot of work and that it was contested at every step of the way. And often whites who are in power or seeking to hold on to power were having to respond and refashion the ways that they asserted their dominance because of black resistance. And schools, I found, were central sites of that struggle over power. You know, in the period when public schools were being founded, you know, there was close associations between education and citizenship, and so creating a school system exclusively for white children was one way of tightening the relationship between race and citizenship. But African Americans like Marie Couvent, the free people of color who are in her circle, who established a school that they propped up and said, look, this is our public school. We pay taxes. We deserve state monies, and they received those state monies. They published their budget in the paper. They adopted the same policies of the public schools. Was a way of pushing back. You know, in talking about David Walker, around the same time that he was publishing his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, you know, Nat Turner's revolt, just a couple of years after Walker published his tract, and you know, in New Orleans, throughout the slaveholding South, literacy and the power that it offered people who were enslaved was frightening to whites who wanted to maintain black people as property, who wanted to maintain their supremacy. And so there was a huge backlash in terms of laws restricting literacy, restricting the education of enslaved people, in some places restricting education of or rights of free people of color. And so, I found that at so many points in time, from the antebellum period through Reconstruction into and through the Jim Crow era, schools were sites of struggle over power. And throughout the pretty long time period I look at, whites were firmly in power and held on to the main levers of power, but African Americans maneuvered within the pockets that were available to them to push back, and consistently schooling, and even the process of establishing a school was often an act of resistance in and of itself.
Yeah, and I really like how you highlight this history. It's not really widely known, such as Georgia that implemented the death penalty for anyone distributing materials, and Alabama and Virginia, they had anti-literacy laws. And then you wrote about how after Nat Turner's rebellion, white residents stormed New Haven City Hall to stop the nation's first black college. White riots vandalized black business, terrorized residents, and they had even attacked a black boarding school owned by Quakers, and they tried to burn down the school.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, in New Orleans, they even passed laws to try to keep additional free blacks from entering Louisiana.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I'll say with a lot of the work that I did, I was able to dig really deep into New Orleans, but then I leaned on the work of historians like Hilary Moss and Heather Andrea Williams, who've written about African American education both during the antebellum and postbellum period, to sort of help me put New Orleans within this national context, and to show that the fear among whites over what education offered African Americans and the threat that educated African Americans could pose to white supremacy more broadly. It was really important for me to show that this was a national phenomenon. It wasn't sort of limited to New Orleans or limited to the slave states, but in places like New Haven in Ohio, you have examples of backlash against black schooling and black education.
I was just kind of commenting on the history that you had conjured up about New Orleans even banning free blacks from entering Louisiana, and just all the violence of education in that area.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what I'd say to this sort of restriction on free blacks entering the city and these sort of other laws that were, generally passed in response to resistance, those further restrictions often varied in terms of how effective they were. So when Louisiana in the 1830s and increasingly in the 1840s began cracking down more and more on free blacks, the free black population of the city dropped dramatically, and some of those individuals likely were able to pass as white, at least on census forms, and as the population was being taken, others likely emigrated and left the city under the repression. But even one thing I sort of found was that in each moment when people in power tried to kind of double down to maintain white supremacy through new restrictions, limiting access to education in different ways, or diverting resources from African Americans to whites, black people continued to, again, maneuver within those limited pockets of power that they had, including sort of turning into institutions, particularly educational institutions, that they had, either full or at least some control over, to survive and to find ways to both keep on living, but to also challenge the oppression they faced.
Along with attacking oppression, I really found this part interesting. I really saw it as a form of internationalism. And you spoke about how part of the students' education at Sisters of Mercy was learning French and writing letters to Haiti, Mexico, and transatlantic places, and how this created a realm against racial oppression. Mm-hmm. And I really found that interesting and kind of something that New Orleans always had, with an inspiration from Haiti and the revolution that they fought over there. And I found that interesting in what you were writing.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a big shift in the writing of U.S. history over the last 20 plus years to really try to view U.S. history within a more global context. I think we read and think about the ways that what's happening in the U.S. is so intimately connected with other parts of the world today, and can sometimes sort of think it's something new, but a nation that sort of came into being through imperialism and conquest, from the start had these ties, and oftentimes the transnationalism and the sort of fluidity of borders, I think, comes into sharper relief in New Orleans. And so, the students at the Catholic institution who were writing these fictional letters to people across the Atlantic world and the Caribbean, and often that was based on very real family ties. And there, as a port city, there was a lot of movement of people and goods into and out of the city, and so the connections that New Orleans had to Haiti and to Cuba and other places was perhaps more pronounced than other places, but it was certainly not the only city in the U.S. that was sort of similarly affected. But, I mean, the impact of the Haitian Revolution on New Orleans in particular was quite pronounced, because in the wake of the revolution, about 10,000 emigres from Saint-Domingue ended up in New Orleans, and this was in 1809, 1810, was a big period of migration. The city's population doubled, and so the influence was incredibly pronounced, and particularly so in certain sections of New Orleans where people from Haiti settled.
Yeah, when I think back on just my education in elementary school, it was extremely colonized. We would write letters like we were on the Mayflower or something, as pilgrims, and with no context either, and then the teacher would burn the edges of a Teen Supers or a Safeway paper sack to make it look like an old calligraphy letter or stuff like that. And when you actually learn the history, the genocide that occurred in these places, and unmasking this U.S. history is so important. Like you mentioned, it's extremely changed over the years. But I mean, even Du Bois was writing these things long ago.
Yeah, no, that's an important thing. The changes I was talking about are sort of within the world of academic history, and oftentimes these sort of seemingly significant changes within the world of academic history. People like Du Bois, in particular, scholars of color, were casting history in this way, making these arguments, decades and generations before they got taken up by formal institutions of higher education sort of recognized within academia.
The next thing I'd like to ask you about is the 1866 incident in Louisiana, when the governor proposed giving the right to vote to blacks and the Constitutional Convention was attacked. I wonder if you could give a summary of this and kind of how this laid the framework further against education or this impact on New Orleans.
So during Reconstruction, African Americans in New Orleans were very aggressive in both pushing for voting rights and also pushing for the elimination of any distinction based upon race, and that included in access to public accommodations, public schools. The 1866 riot had particular national significance because there was a riot that year in New Orleans, as you were mentioning, in response to a convention that was being called to enfranchise African American men, and there was also a similarly and particularly bloody riot in Memphis in 1866. And those two events, both of those riots in New Orleans and Memphis, one of the targets of white rioters were black schools. Many schools were being established throughout the South for recently emancipated slaves. They were a symbol that not just that blacks were no longer enslaved, but a symbol of black eligibility for citizenship, because there had been this connection that had developed between schooling, particularly government-sponsored schooling, and citizenship. And so, looking back on it, obviously tragic, but not surprising that whites who were rioting and trying to protest the extension of citizenship rights to African Americans would target schools. And it was the violence of the rioting in New Orleans as well as in Memphis. There was a key spark for Congress to pass the Reconstruction Acts and to take a much more aggressive stand in terms of supporting African American citizenship and taking a significantly stronger approach to Reconstruction. And politically, as constituencies in the North saw the violence in a place like New Orleans, it swayed many who had perhaps been lukewarm to an expanded federal role in support of African American rights. It was a sort of shock to their system and realizing that something greater had to be done. And so the 1867 Reconstruction Acts, established military, federal military presence and control in enforcing ultimately black voting rights and citizenship rights in the South.
And wasn't this also known as the Battle of Liberty Place?
So the Battle of Liberty Place was actually a separate Reconstruction era battle. It gets
that's the Battle of September 14th.
September 14th, 1874. Was also known as the Battle of Liberty Place.
Okay, I'm mixing up my white riots here.
Yeah, well, no, it's unfortunately easy to do because Reconstruction in particular, although you can look beyond Reconstruction, was a period of great contestation and often violent contestation over the status of African Americans, and so there was political conventions that were going on where quite a lot was at stake. There were contested elections, which was the spark for the 1874 Liberty Place riot, and war and violence is often politics through other means. And when former Confederates were put out of power and seeking to reestablish their power and reestablish a government centered around white supremacy, when they politically did not have the power to do so, they frequently turned to arms and to violence to try to reestablish their authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on this battle of September 14th, this was when the Crescent White League tried to overthrow the state's ruling biracial coalition, as he wrote. And one of the future U.S. Supreme Court as Edward Douglas White was in this fight, as you wrote about. And this further attack on education in New Orleans kind of laid this groundwork into continually promoting white supremacy and race segregation in the state. I think this was something you pointed out when Dr. Swords, he was speaking to the board, and his dad was a veteran of this Battle of Liberty place. And I really thought that this was interesting that these things echoed well into the 60s of further segregating the schools, which led to housing, and this pretty much the thesis of your book, which was segregated schools gave rise to segregated communities, which in turn created structural inequality in housing that impeded desegregation's capacity to promote racial justice. My question in here is you laced all of these things together so well, and I know these are very complex, and you've been breaking it down. But as a whole, of your perception of writing history, how did you approach this when writing this book? And kind of what inspired this? What was like your aha moment when you were doing research of kind of when you saw that this was opening up in the research?
So I can think of one very clear aha moment, and I can say a little bit more about how it developed, and then some of the decisions I made about how I structured the book. But so initially, I was doing research on mass desegregation in New Orleans, and as was the case throughout much of the South and really throughout much of the country, desegregation did not begin on a really large scale until the late 60s, and it was because of pressure from the federal courts after years and years of resistance following Brown. And I'd been doing research on the desegregation of one particular high school in New Orleans, and as often happens through research, I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to be writing about the desegregation of high schools, I need to learn a little bit more about the growth of segregated secondary education, thinking that this would just be sort of background that would deepen my discussion of the period of desegregation. It was actually the book grew out of a dissertation I wrote at Tulane University, and it was a professor there who was asking me a question of, this high school you're writing about, why did it end up being located where it was? When was it built? I said, well, I don't really know, so let me go look. And it was in the course of researching the history of this white high school in uptown New Orleans that had opened in the early 1930s, and then also researching the creation of the first black high school in New Orleans in the post-Reconstruction period, a school called McDonough 35 that opened in 1917. As I was learning about how these two schools came into being, I was seeing all these connections between the establishment of high schools and broader discussions about urban development, urban growth, and urban change, and the future of neighborhoods. And there were a handful of historians at the time who were beginning to write about connections between school policy and housing policy, or school policy and residential segregation. And they were doing studies of other places. And just in the records that I was going through, I found that this connection between segregated schooling and residential segregation and the growth of a segregated city just seemed so pronounced. And I said, okay, I've got to, initially I said I'm going to write a chapter on this, and then it will just be the sort of background for this study that's eventually going to be about desegregation. But the deeper I got into the research and the writing, that became the story, because I found that not only were decisions about the location of schools and the racial designation of schools key to trying to retool the racial geography of the city and sort of sort the population, but that resources and investment flowed in very different ways to neighborhoods that had white versus black schools. Areas that got white schools, and often the school board was identifying locations for white schools before people had even moved into these areas. Developers were just beginning to think about building out new neighborhoods, and the school board would, tag that for a white school, and then those areas would get zoning protections, be restricted to single-family housing, so multifamily housing apartments that would, be for lower-income people would be cut out of those areas. Those areas would get paved streets, sidewalks, sewage, all these things that were, increasing the value of property in that area, whereas areas that receive black schools, like the area near the Superdome where this first black high school, McDonough 35, was initially located, the city would literally tear down the surrounding neighborhoods. And, it created a base for the huge wealth disparities that we have today, because certain people with various levels of government or significant levels of government support coming from a variety of places were able to build up wealth through property, while black people were, largely cut out of that process.
Mm-hmm. Continuing in on this about neighborhoods and schooling and segregation, I wanted to speak about Superintendent Bauer and the Crutchnet School. And he had made a statement that the enrollment was falling off because of black people coming into the neighborhood, and he was saying that new accommodations were needed, and he had made this racist statement. And 3 weeks later, you write, arsonists ignited the first in a series of bombs targeting black property near Crutchnet. And you also mentioned that the target appeared to be the Black Lincoln Theater, and that 2 nights later, a stick of dynamite or small bomb exploded on the steps of Henry E. Braden's home. And he was the owner of the Black Astoria Hotel near McDonough 35 High School, as you had just mentioned. And kind of the impact of this and this amount of violence that was going on, and it's not that you directly correlated Bauer's statement to it, but it definitely seemed like there's something to that for sure, and it contributed to this violence. And if you could speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, so the context, this occurred in 1925, and in New Orleans and throughout the country, the teens and the 20s were a period where cities were trying to do a lot more planning and organizing as their populations were growing, as their populations were becoming more diverse, both through immigration, but in the case of many northern cities, the first Great Migration, African-American populations were growing much more. And in this move to create greater order in growing cities, there was an assumption that segregation was really beneficial, that it was beneficial for property values, it was beneficial for stability, and it was linked to broader efforts to create clearer lines between residential and commercial and industrial areas. And so sort of an operating assumption among government officials, people banking and real estate was that areas with residents who were not white or that were frequented by black people, by certain immigrant groups, were of lesser value. And there was a desire to try to retool the geography and built environment of cities to create greater homogeneity and to protect white property values. And so this particular incident, as you said, the superintendent made a comment about seeming changing racial demographics of a neighborhood, and that maybe this neighborhood was better suited for a black school than a white school. And while I don't have a sort of clear connection between the bombings and the violence that followed a few weeks later, it seems very plausible that it's connected because residents in the city at this time were well aware of the connections that were drawn between race and the future of neighborhoods and future investment in neighborhood. And they understood very directly the racist logic behind city planning and investment. And so I kind of read the violence as a sort of white defense of this racially, demographically changing neighborhood where they were targeting black homeowners and trying to reassert that their area was a white neighborhood because, as they had seen in other neighborhoods, one of them being where McDonough 35 was located, that areas with black schools were essentially written off, or with black residents were written off. And so, they wanted to preserve this Crutchnitz school as a school for white children, thinking that if there was a school for white children in their neighborhood would be seen as white, and it would receive support, investment, services from the city. And then if they lost the school, they felt like they'd be losing the neighborhood.
Yeah, and this battle was pretty explicit. You mentioned how there was large placards declaring that the area was, quote, for white people, and that a sign block read, "Under the new law, Act 119 of 1924, this block is for white only. Anyone destroying the sign will be dealt with according to law." And these things are just explicit in the things you were writing about.
Yeah, and that law of 1924, New Orleans passed a residential segregation ordinance. Baltimore had passed the nation's first residential segregation ordinance in 1910. A number of other cities followed. In 1917, the Supreme Court said these ordinances were unconstitutional, and while it was a civil rights victory to a degree, the logic of the decision was one of that declaring certain areas could only be for one race would restrict the transfer of property and restrict property rights, that someone wouldn't be able to sell their property to a person they might want to sell. And so it was not necessarily a decision that was decided on sort of egalitarian ideals. But despite the Supreme Court saying, look, you can't have residential segregation laws, New Orleans passed a law in 1924 in its attempt to implement the law, often targeted areas where African Americans were already firmly established, essentially trying to kind of, almost a process of sort of conquest and reclamation of trying to remove people and take the land. New Orleans, that law was overturned in 1927 because it, clearly violated an existing Supreme Court decision. But yeah, along with laws like that, and then often in lieu of laws, both in terms of the use of force and violence, and very direct language that didn't leave anything to the imagination. Whites tried to defend not just the notion of white supremacy, but often sort of defending territory, defending neighborhoods, and this was something pronounced in New Orleans, but certainly not limited to New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. In your book, I really notice your use of language. You use words such as pogrom or white terrorism. It's very direct, and the history that you write is refreshing. I wanted to ask you about your decision on the use of language and how important that is in the writing of history and of dealing with the trauma that people of color, Black and Indigenous people have dealt with in this country, and how important that is to healing.
And so, I think the terminology that we use is incredibly important, and also that the sort of decisions about what language to use, what terms to use, is not always clear cut, and it can be complex, and sometimes words are used at one point in time to great effect, but then sort of lose their power. I'll say in terms of some of the terms that you cited and that I used, I think every not just professional historians like myself, but anytime anyone is talking about the past, they're presenting an interpretation of the past. We sort of know and I'd like to think more rather than less often can agree on what happened, although we live in an age where seemingly everything is sort of up for dispute. But assuming that we can agree on sort of what happened, historians and again sort of anyone who's sort of telling the past is trying to explain well why did it happen and what meaning do we give to this past. And so we're kind of constantly engaged in a process of not rewriting what happened in the past, but rewriting and rethinking how we should understand and make sense of that past. And so I think, referring to white terrorists who are trying to overthrow the government, being very explicit and sometimes pointed, and not just talking about violence, but in referring to something like pogroms. I mean, some of it is I use for purposeful emotional impact, and then to sort of jar people, hopefully, into realizing that. Oh, okay, yeah, a lot of what we sort of think about the country, and that is often told in a very sanitized or even celebratory manner, particularly when we're talking about histories of conquest and colonization and of white supremacy and the subordination of whether it's indigenous peoples or people of African descent. Often this is presented in like I said, sort of very sanitized ways, and so I think it's important that historians use language that is precise, but is also helping people sort of call into question the history that either we don't think about, or if we do think about, often just sort of take for granted. And so it's in my writing, but then also my teaching, I have a lot of conversations with my students about the language that we use and when phrases sort of lose their utility. I mean, so my book's, much of it's about residential segregation and the disparate or uneven allocation of resources to areas identified as white versus areas identified as black. And, I was pretty direct in largely avoiding the use of the word ghetto, within historical scholarship, coming out of the 60s and into the 80s, 90s, and even more recently. Historians will often talk about sort of the process of ghetto formation and the building up of ghettos when describing the segregation and isolation of African Americans within urban America. The use of that term was often used to explicitly draw parallels to places like the Warsaw Ghetto and Nazi policies as a way to sort of show the extent of isolation and imposed upon African American communities and the extent of white supremacy. But I think the one reason I didn't use that term is that the term ghetto is taken on such pejorative connotation and often sort of used in popular speech as a way to sort of pass judgment on people living in a segregated neighborhood. And, I wanted to sort of avoid that association while still showing the highly orchestrated work of government at the local level, federal level, in city government, in schools, to isolate African Americans residentially. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the language that I use, and sometimes the most exciting debates among historians are about sort of the best way to characterize what it is we're describing historically.
Well, that's one thing I really found refreshing about your writing. You see a lot of people write with a sugar coating of hoping to get tenureship or something like that. You never know exactly what it is, but your writing was authentic and eye-opening. I appreciate you for your work in releasing this, and I hope more people read your book, Race and Education in New Orleans. And my final question was, you write about post-Katrina, how by 2017, 93% of public school students attended a charter. And with the current state of education in New Orleans and the legacy of what you write about and kind of where you see it's at right now.
So, I mean, at the end of the book, I make a few main points about kind of the current state of education in New Orleans. And, one is that one of the main points I make throughout the book is that schools and school policies profoundly shaped the urban landscape of New Orleans, the structure of neighborhoods, the disparities between neighborhoods. And I think looking at this close historical connections between schools and housing and school and broader investment in communities helps us call into question some of the sort of assumptions of behind charter schools. Some of the kind of operating logic of breaking up publicly operated school districts, based on generally neighborhood zones for neighborhood, is that there are inequalities that exist in cities like New Orleans. There are inequalities that exist along racial and class lines between neighborhoods, and often predominantly white and wealthier neighborhoods have better schools than poorer, predominantly black neighborhoods. And so if we live in a segregated society, it's better just to give students the opportunity to choose to go to whichever school they want to go to, and the schools that are popular and that are doing well will attract students, and the schools that aren't doing that well will go under, or somebody else will take it over and do a better job. And it's this sort of marketplace idea, but central to that is sort of severing this connection between school and community. And I guess to put it bluntly, sort of thinking about the history that I've looked at, in my mind, that assumption or that idea of severing the connection between schools and neighborhood kind of gets it all wrong, because the policies that I write about historically, decisions about schools, had great impact for the resources and support that communities received. And so looking at a neighborhood that's maybe been struggling because of this long legacy of divestment and public neglect, and rather than investing in that neighborhood and jointly investing in that school, and also recognizing, particularly within African American communities in New Orleans, the ways that historically black schools and historically black communities often sustained one another, where schools were really centers of community and community were investing in schools, that the current reforms are just sort of missing a huge opportunity to use, or not to use, but to embrace schools as a vehicles for broader investment in communities and strengthening communities. So I say in the book that, two lessons we can take from the history is that, on the one hand, we ask too much from schools, because I think, by kind of writing off efforts to address segregation and inequality directly, and sort of thinking that, if we give kids choice in schools, that will lead to opportunity and access to college and jobs, we're sort of overlooking the structural nature and deeply ingrained nature of inequality, and sort of asking schools to do everything. And then the other lesson I say you can take from the history is that we're also not asking schools to do enough, and then by kind of separating schools from communities, we're overlooking or forgetting the real power investment in schools can have in terms of broader investment and strengthening of communities.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, Dr. Stern, I really appreciate talking to you and you taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, I really appreciate your interest in the questions and giving me the opportunity to talk about my work.
Thanks for checking out this episode. I have links to Walter's bio and his book in the show notes. Thanks to Awareness for the music. Please share the podcast, rate it, and spam it all around. If you can, support the show's Patreon. It's also linked in the show notes. Thank you so much.